सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
We are at the peak of the G20 season, and there is no better moment than this to look at the geopolitical state of the world. And one way of seeing that is to see who's not going where. Now, I'm not referring to Xi Jinping or to Putin. We know that both are not coming to India. Both might have their own reasons. Although Xi Jinping, until the time we are recording this, he's not even been polite enough to call our Prime Minister Narendra Modi to say he isn't coming or why he isn't coming. But in China, they do things as the Chinese do. Xi Jinping in particular is setting his own rules. So we will not go there. And that is not the story for us. That is not the highlight to begin with, because we know where the Chinese policy is vis-a-vis India and vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We also know where Russia's policy is. We also know how close Russia and China are right now and how dependent Russia is on China at this point of time. So that is not where we are going, because if I did, I won't be telling you anything new. The important thing is, see who else isn't going someplace. Because what I find more significant in terms of somebody not going where he was expected to be is Joe Biden as the President of the United States of America. Joe Biden will become this year the first American president, the first in 22 years to be not present at one of the three sites of the 9/11 attacks on the anniversary of the attacks. This will be 22 years for the attacks. September 11, that is this Monday, and Joe Biden will not be present. Why will he not be present? So immediately your reaction might be, as mine was, that what is it? He's coming for G20. How could he be in two places at the same time? But the fact is that if you just know how the calendar works and how the time zones work, in fact, he could have finished G20 and flown back to the US and attended the 9/11 commemoration. Why does he become now the first president not to do so? Because he also wanted to go from India to Vietnam. He wanted to make a visit to Vietnam. America and Vietnam are now signing a strategic partnership. This is really like rubbing your finger in China's eye. And Biden did not want to lose this opportunity. Now, in the process, not only does he miss the event, 9/11 event, he in fact when he goes back, he makes a refueling stop in Alaska. Alaska is where usually US presidents, when they're traveling long distances, they make refueling stops. So he makes a refueling stop in Alaska, and that is where he will attend the 9/11 ceremony from there. And at the sites of the attacks, it will be Kamala Harris and Jill Biden, his wife, if she is recovered from COVID by then, which means if she is tested negative from COVID by then. Now, this gives you an idea of how important this new change, this new geopolitical change in the Indo-Pacific is. Because Indo-Pacific isn't just the flavor of the fortnight or the month. This is the pivot on which global politics right now is moving. And that's why this G20, I know that in India, we also see that Prime Minister Modi has turned it into his election campaign, which is all right. Politicians do that. After all, who else will do it if not politicians in democracies? But more importantly, on a global stage, this is also a very good window into how new geopolitics is playing out. So once again, President Biden becomes the first American president in 22 years to miss the 9/11 commemoration at one of the three sites. Now that done, he signs this agreement with Vietnam. Now Vietnam is an interesting country. We know that America and Vietnam fought a famous or an infamous war, depending on where you are coming from. Infamous if you were an American because they lost it. It was also an unjust war that they launched on Vietnam. And famous for the Vietnamese because they won that war. But since then, since the change in Vietnam and since the change in the world, particularly after the end of the Cold War, American-Vietnamese relations have been improving. In fact, every president from Bush to Clinton onwards, Trump twice, every US president has traveled to Vietnam. That's what Biden is also doing right now. This time, however, they signed a strategic partnership with Vietnam. That's a new thing. Now, Vietnam is in a peculiar situation. Vietnam is both a beneficiary of what's happening in China, it's also a victim of China. It's a victim of China because China claims so many of its islands that Vietnam thinks are theirs. The Spratlys, Parasols, we spoke about it in an earlier episode of Cut The Clutter. In fact, we've spoken about it multiple times. In fact, it was near one of these islands that the Chinese fired a water cannon at one of the Vietnamese fishing boats. The Chinese are also building an airstrip, in fact, an air base at one of these islands. Satellite pictures have just come out. So the Vietnamese are very upset about the Chinese and very concerned about the Chinese. It's a big territorial and sovereignty issue. At the same time, I said Vietnamese are also beneficiaries of what's happening in China. And why did I say that Vietnam is also a beneficiary of what's happening in China? Because at the root of that also lie China-US relations. Because of the increase in US tariffs and restrictions on imports from China, and this urgency now on the part of so many major economies, including India, by the way, to shift production bases, to shift supply chains. Most countries in the world have depended on imports from China, and they are concerned about their supply lines all being under Chinese control. So many of them are shifting, and the biggest beneficiary of that shift, particularly by American and Japanese companies from China, is Vietnam. So Vietnam is both a victim and a beneficiary of what's happening in China. Biden visit to Vietnam tells you that is the headline point for me on how geopolitics has now changed. There is much else beyond that. Now, this Biden visit to Vietnam will just come via Delhi, where also he will meet not just Narendra Modi, that's a bilateral, but also MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Crown Prince. We also know that he was accused of having masterminded the assassination of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Nevertheless, when it comes to relations between countries look at their larger national interests. So Biden will be seeing him, meeting him in Delhi as well. That will be a bilateral, and there will be much else. So I will take you to the next indication of this change, particularly in the US policy in the Indo-Pacific and in the larger region. But before that, let me also remind you of what happened just before this. Just before this, Biden met his counterparts from Japan and South Korea, and they signed the Trilateral Defense Accord. Once again, if that's not about Indo-Pacific, then we got to get our geography completely reread. That's also about Indo-Pacific. So what you see around China is that a lot of these mini alliances are coming up, and all of these have been caused by the direction in which Xi Jinping has pushed China. Now, in the same period, see some of the other things that have happened. June 1 this year, the Americans opened their embassy or reopened their embassy in Seychelles. Seychelles, as we know, is an Indian Ocean island, right? It's far away. It inhabits not even 1 lakh people. Actually, at last count, just over 93,000 people, but very strategically positioned island with a population, not such a poor country, right? 96, 97 or thereabouts, Americans began pulling out of there. They began pulling out of there. Why? Because they thought Cold War was over, Soviet bloc had broken up, right? They had a large listening post there. CIA had a large listening post in Seychelles, which tracked Soviet satellites from Seychelles. Now, Soviet Union wasn't there, so those satellites did not have to be tracked, and the Americans pulled out. 23 years back, Americans shut down the embassy because they thought it was too expensive. A country of, at that point, must have been some 50, 60, 70,000 people. Why are they running an embassy there? And American embassies are not budget operations, low budget operations. They are extensive. An American embassy is an American embassy. So they pulled out. Now, June 1 this year, they reopened their embassy in Seychelles after 27 years. That is bang in the southern Indian Ocean, in the vast empty spaces, which can be the playgrounds of large navies. Then see the moves that the Americans have made in Maldives. In Malé, the capital of Maldives, the Americans opened their embassy, and it's only yesterday that the new ambassador, American ambassador, the first American ambassador ever, presented his credentials. Once again, it's part of the same Indian Ocean or Indo-Pacific move. In fact, in 2020, when Mike Pompeo, then US Secretary of State, had come for a visit to the region, he had gone to Sri Lanka and Maldives, and that had been taken note of. In fact, I had also written about it. I had also featured Pompeo in a video interview, of which I'll share a link with you. You can see that. So Americans had made that opening already in Trump era as well. So once again, this policy, the new Indo-Pacific policy and the new American-led approach to geopolitics in our region cuts across political lines in America. It has started slowly but carefully in the Clinton era, Bush, then Obama, Trump, and now Joe Biden is taking it forward, except that now the intensity is much greater. So I told you about the new embassy in Seychelles. I told you about the first ever ambassador in Maldives. Again, stay with me in the same region. In the month of May, the Americans carried out the groundbreaking ceremony of their new embassy building in Mauritius. Mauritius, again, is a country with just about 1 million population. And if you think all this activity looks like just purely an American action plan, see what India has done. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi was at ASEAN Summit, and there he made this call from Delhi to Dili. And what was that call? Dili, D-I-L-I, is the capital of a tiny country called Timor-Leste. Why is it called Timor-Leste? I will just tell you. Timor-Leste is a country again of just over 1 billion people, maybe 1.3 billion people. They have a fast growing population, 1.3 billion people, vast Christian majority. They had broken away from Indonesia. One part of the Timor island had broken away from Indonesia and became East Timor. Timor-Leste, Leste is Portuguese. In Portuguese, Leste means east. And what does Timor mean? Timor in Malay language also means east. So earlier, when it was called East Timor, then the joke was, why should the country be called East or Timor? Sometimes it was even called Timor. Now it's called Timor-Leste, which again means East Timor. East Timor is a sovereign country, has been a sovereign country for some time. It fought for freedom first against the Portuguese and then against Indonesians. In fact, if I take you back to RSS Sarsang Chalak Mohan Bhagwat's lecture on the Shara Day, he had said that sometimes population imbalance, which means the rise in the number of population of one religion in some area, can lead to countries breaking up. And one of the examples he had used besides Kosovo, and one of the examples he had used was also East Timor. So East Timor was a territory in Indonesia, or controlled by Indonesia, which had a very large Christian majority and broke away. Nevertheless, Prime Minister Modi announced that India is opening its first embassy in East Timor. Why is India going to Timor-Leste? It's such a small country, right? It is going there because East Timor also sits on top of the sea lanes that are so critical to the Indo-Pacific region. So if you look at the map of the region, go right to the top, right to the other end of the Nicobar Island chain, and then if you generally go east and south from there, then you go into these really complicated water channels that ultimately will take you to the Pacific, but these are very narrow water channels also, and Timor-Leste will be found somewhere there. So India has now gone and opened an embassy there. All of this is happening in concert because all said and done, Quad nations now are acting in concert. They may not call it a security alliance, but every harkat of theirs, every activity of theirs points only in one direction. If you still have any doubts, then also see what William Burns, the CIA chief, was doing in Colombo just this February. He was in Colombo, and from what I read and understand, the idea was to revive the old Sri Lanka American Status of Forces agreement so the US could send its forces there if needed. Now, this is at a time when the Chinese have been building their influence in Sri Lanka. They, in fact, for all practical purposes, control a part of Sri Lanka, that is the port of Hambantota, which has been leased to China for 99 years because the Sri Lankans cannot repay their debt. In that situation, William Burns has gone there, and you can see also that India has really intensified its interaction with Sri Lanka at the same time. In fact, we had the Sri Lankan High Commissioner to India come and speak in our newsroom, and he said that India gave us all these loans when we needed them most of all without any preconditions. You can understand what that means, because Chinese it is who bring loans with preconditions, who have high interest rates, and who want collateral. So once again, if you want to see the larger picture of American moves, see the message they are taking everywhere. Now, Jake Sullivan, the American National Security Advisor, while speaking in the White House just the other day, he had said, in fact, he had promoted the virtues of multilateral global lending institutions, and he said that these are healthy, fair lending institutions. And I quote from him, he said in his interaction with the media at White House, and I quote, "We know that these institutions are some of the most effective tools that we have for mobilizing transparent, high-quality investment into developing countries." And then he went on to say, and I quote again, "We believe there should be a high standard, non-coercive." So important is non-coercive. "We believe that there should be a high standard, non-coercive lending option available to low and middle income countries." That means don't go to China, because if you go to China, you will go broke at various points of time. But if you go to China to borrow, you might end up losing your property, your territory, or even your sovereignty. Look at what's happened to the Sri Lankans and many other countries in Africa also. The similar game is playing out. So this is also a counter to the Chinese BRI. It's not called a counter, it does not have a name yet, and it is not something that America or India or Japan or Australia, Quad allies, or South Korea and all of the others are doing, or UK, they are doing together as a grouping or as individuals. They are not doing this as individual countries or specific alliances, but the idea is to then put these multilateral lending institutions, where, by the way, China is a shareholder, multilateral institutions as a counter to the Chinese influence and BRI, which is seen as exploitative and also extortionist. I just mentioned to you a couple of minutes back that William Burns, or Bill Burns, the CIA chief, was in Colombo talking about a status of forces agreement. There is also another something that India and America are jointly interested in around Sri Lanka. That is, nobody would say it to me formally, but that is what I understand from what I read and what I watch, that there is a great deal of shared interest and concern between India and the US on what passes through the undersea communication cables next to Sri Lanka. Now, the Americans have had a listening post there for a very long time, and this is how the world is changed. Until the mid-80s, it began in the mid-70s, the peak of the Cold War. Until the mid-80s, India was neurotic. We were neurotic about the fact that the Americans had Voice of America transmitters. Voice of America, that's a broadcasting service. Voice of America transmitters at Trincomalee. And we thought that those were used to snoop on us, and those could be used to snoop on not just us, but our allies and friends, the Soviets at that point of time. But today, the world has changed so much geopolitically that India and America are willing to work together in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, because it's part of the same shared pursuit that India is present in strength in Mauritius, where these big junctions of these cables lie, near some relatively remote islands not far from the Mauritian capital. In fact, I had featured a controversy about that in an episode of Cut The Clutter just a year or so back. That was episode number 1044. I will share a link with you. You can check it out. That episode, in fact, was headlined "A Submarine Geopolitical Mess in Mauritius Involving Data Security, Spying Charges, China and India." As G20 opens, therefore, we can say that a new great game is now opening out, and that is being played in the Indo-Pacific. And that's where you find so many countries have come together. They do not call it a security alliance. Some cases, they do call these security alliances. AUKUS, for example, is a security alliance. The trilateral partnership that US, Japan and South Korea have done, that is called a defense alliance. But many of the others are bilateral strategic partnerships, as say India and the US and Vietnam from next week on. But these countries are also working together to balance China. Nobody wants to go to war with China, but they're trying to balance China in the region. Again, you want to see how important the region is. Look at the embassies the Americans have set up in this region, in this larger region, expanded region. Seychelles, I told you about. I told you Maldives, they've just sent their first resident ambassador. Tonga, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Kiribati. Take a map of the world, take a map of the Indian Ocean, the southern Indian Ocean, the vast empty expanse of Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and identify where these places are, and you will then understand geopolitics. So look at the map of the world and enlarge it. You will see it on your screen now. Enlarge it where the southern Indian Ocean is the vast empty expanse of southern Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and spot these countries. Spot these countries, small island nations or archipelagos, very small populations. Why are the Americans going and setting up embassies there? Now, I could also ask you a counter question. Why is India going and setting up an embassy in Timor-Leste? Because they all have the same objective in mind. They want to go and tell the Chinese that, look, we are here. And they also want to tell all these smaller countries in the region that, look, don't be so easily intimidated by the Chinese, because there are also others present in the region. Before I conclude, I will also remind you that on 19th of November 2022, when India was just taking over the G20 presidency, I had written a national interest column which was headlined "How Vishwaguru Can Get New Strategic Space and Modi Another Stage in Pre-Election Year." So first of all, this is a big stage for Narendra Modi in pre-election year. On that, there can be no argument. And as we have just discussed for almost 20 minutes now, a vast new geostrategic space has opened out for India as well. I'm also sharing with you a very good article, in fact, which I've read carefully and from which I found some important insights for this episode of Cut The Clutter. That's an article by Alexander Ward and Jonathan Lemire. Also has inputs from Phelim Kine, and the headline of the article is "Biden to Sell America's Partnerships, All at China's Expense."